Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Diogo Pinheiro. I'm a linguistics professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And this is Abralinha ao Vivo Linguists Online, which is a great initiative of the Brazilian Linguistics Association designed to give students and researchers free access to state-of-the-art discussion in many different fields of linguistics. So by the way, thank you, Abralinha. I believe this is precisely the kind of initiative that we need in these tough times we are all going through, particularly here in Brazil, given our government's ability to keep worsening the sanitary crisis. So today's speaker, who I have the honor and the privilege to introduce, is Professor Thomas Hoffmann, who is chair of English language and linguistics at the Catholic University in Eichstätt, Ingolstadt. Sorry about my German, by the way. And Professor Hoffmann is well known for his work in youth-based construction grammar, language variation, change, and multimodal communication. So as many of you know, he's one of the editors of the Oxford Handbook of Construction Grammar and the author of two important books in the field, Preposition Placement in English and English Comparative Correlatives. So today we'll talk about a classic issue in linguistics with linguistic creativity, but he will approach this issue from a not so classic vantage point, which is the vantage point of construction grammar. So in fact, his talk is entitled Linguistic Creativity, a Construction Grammar Perspective. So Professor Hoffmann, on behalf of Abralinha, I'd like to thank you for having accepted this invitation to be here today. And also I'd like to remind the audience that questions can be asked in the chat. I'll be happy to read them to Professor Hoffmann at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Diogo, for this very kind introduction. Thank you to Miguel and everyone at Abralinha Vivo for giving me the chance to give this talk. These are difficult times indeed. I hope you're all safe. And at least this is one way of staying in touch and of exchanging ideas. So I'm really grateful, particularly because the topic at hand, linguistic creativity, is one that has haunted me for a couple of years now. Because, as you know, I come from a construction grammar background, and we're really good at constructions and entrenchment of constructions. And there's a claim that it's constructions all the way and it's all stored. And that does explain quite a lot. But for some time now, I've had the hunch that particularly in usage-based construction grammar, we put almost too much focus on what is stored on the constructions. And we focus a little bit, not enough, on the constructs, on the individual utterances. And nowhere is this as pressing as when it comes to linguistic creativity. So this is my view of the topic. It's an emerging field. A couple of colleagues are currently publishing on this. And you're more than welcome all to contribute. And I look already very much forward to your questions on the topic. What I will do today is give a very brief introduction to construction grammar as a theory of language. And I will ask the question, how can construction grammar deal with linguistic creativity? And almost more importantly, what interesting aspects and questions does linguistic creativity raise for construction grammar? Some of the solutions are going to lie in looking at networks, and that means individual cognitive networks, as well as social aspects of social networks. I will argue that conceptual blending plays a huge role in all of this, and I follow Mark Turner and Gilles Fauconnier in this, in thinking that perhaps it is the only way of how we combine constructions, and that this is a very crucial, important mechanism for individual constructional creativity. My examples will come from literary language, jokes, multimodal constructs that I hope you will find interesting and hopefully also pertinent to the topic. So linguistic creativity, as Diogo said, is at the heart of linguistics. Back in 1965, Noam Chomsky already said, within traditional linguistic theory, furthermore, it was clearly understood that one of the qualities that all languages have in common is their creative aspect. Thus, an essential property of language is that it provides the means for expressing indefinitely many thoughts and for reacting appropriately in an indefinite range of new situations. It is therefore not surprising that Goldberg in a 2006 book picked up on this and said that constructional approaches share with mainstream generative grammar the goal of accounting for the creative potential of language. That is, it is clear that language is not a set of sentences that can be fixed and advanced. allowing constructions to combine freely as long as there are no conflicts allows for the infinitely creative potential of language. Underlying of both of these definitions, however, I would argue, is the idea that very often in linguistics, we treat creativity as productivity. So if something novel comes up and it's based on an existing rule, on an existing schema, however you want to frame it, then we already call this creative. From a psychological perspective, and I think it's fair to say that this is the field that has done most research on creativity, creativity is, of course, defined slightly differently. The standard definition is by Simonton, who says creativity is originality times appropriateness. If you think about it like this, singing happy birthday on someone's birthday is, well, highly appropriate, but not very creative or original because lots of people have done it. At the same time, if you want to write a novel, it would be really original if you had a bit of bird seed and poured it over a keyboard and had birds picking away at the keyboard and they would type words in quotation marks. But of course, it wouldn't be appropriate because no one could read it, no one would understand it. So there you can already see that for something to be creative, it must not only be novel to a certain degree, but it must be deemed appropriate by a reference group. When we talk about creativity, very often we also talk about creativity with a capital C. So this high art, high class creativity, the invention of the wheel, the iPhone, classical music composers being really creative, Shakespeare and so on. So high quality and aesthetic quality is sometimes also added to this definition. But I would on this talk also talk a bit more about little c, the creativity of individuals, which might not have this long-lasting effect of a Shakespearean sonnet, but is still really important to a social group at a particular point in time. And of course, there are many other definitions and many aspects from which and perspectives from which you can look at creativity. One important bit, and we're going to look at this, is of course, who is creative? Is it the speaker? Is it the hearer? What enables them to do this? What are the cognitive processes that allow us to be creative? As I will argue, it's the underlying constructional network together with constructional blending. Then when do we consider a product to be creative? Well, that's going to be the utterance level, the construct, but it needs to be evaluated by a speech community that they think it was innovative and of an appropriate quality. And of course, there are also interesting questions about where someone is creative, when they are creative, the specific situation, and pragmatic and sociolinguistic pieces of information play into this. From the start, however, I would like to point out, and towards the end, I'm going to come back to this, that of course, in psychological research, there is a huge focus on individual creativity, because it is clear that there are inter-individual differences with respect to intelligence, openness, extroversion, and so on. Now, in linguistics, be it from a generative perspective, because of the assumption of a universal grammar, or from a cognitive construction grammar perspective, where you assume that, well, all speakers have the same kind of cognitive setup, we're very often concerned about homogeneity, and of course, all languages are equally valid and equally good, but we know that individual speakers differ with respect to their linguistic abilities. Some are more fluent, some are brilliant writers, some people are really funny, whereas others are not. So there are, of course, clines of creativity. Even though we still believe in something like the abstract notion of a native speaker, even native speakers differ greatly. And that is something where creative research and creative construction grammar research needs to take a closer look. Okay, for those of you not familiar with construction grammar assumes that at the heart of grammar is form meaning pairings. These are arbitrary and conventional, and the classic ones are words. So something like apple is a Caesarean sign. It's got a form, either a string of sounds or letters, so apple in English, and it's got a meaning associated with it, apple in this case. And I'm only using a shorthand notation here. Obviously, from a cognitive perspective, we would assume that apple evokes a rich conceptual experiential frame. So you know what an apple tastes like, its shape. You can almost imagine having one in your hand, what the weight would be. So it's a rich encyclopedic knowledge that we've got stored here, but we just abbreviate it for the sake of notation. We know that this is arbitrary. I mean, this is an old staple because different languages use different string of sounds for a similar concept. So in German, it's Apfel, in French, it's Pomme, and in Hungarian, Olmo, completely different strings of sounds, which are related, however, in a conventional way in a speech community to a specific meaning. And that means an individual speaker, in order to use it, must have stored this association of form and meaning, which we call a constructions, in their mind. What construction grammar now does is it extends the notion of a linguistic sign to all levels of linguistic analysis. So morphemes, something like untrue, unfriendly, and ungucci, can also be created by a schema that has a form level with un followed by some kind of adjective, and the meaning is not whatever the adjective, whatever property the adjective has. So untrue is not true, unfriendly is not friendly. This schema is going to be related to the adjective schemas in a bidirectional horizontal way, so that you can go one way or the other. If you invent a new adjective, gediddle, then you could have it a corresponding ungediddle. But at the same time, you can also go the other way, because this is not an input-output relationship. It's two schemas being related. So if someone says, oh, this was so ungucci, I immediately understand what they mean, even though before that utterance, I never used Gucci as an adjective. So then I know, oh, this is so ungucci, which means something can also be so Gucci. Okay. Now, we've already seen that morphemes can be captured as form-meaning pairings, and words, obviously, but also idioms, as in John kicked the bucket and she spills the beans, are form-meaning pairings. They slightly differ. In John kicks the bucket, the whole string kick the bucket is related to die, and then the subject slot specifies the person that passes away. In she spills the beans, on the other hand, the beans stand for information, and the subject slot is the person that tells the secret. And this explains, well, why this construction can also be used in the passive. So you can say the beans were spilt, because in this case, the beans has an independent meaning of information, of a thing that can be affected, like a patient, and that's why it fits the passive construction. In contrast to this, the bucket has no independent meaning in kick the bucket, so you cannot passivize this. So some people would argue that there are ways out of this, but maybe we can talk about this in the discussion session. But once you enter the field of idioms, and you can see that these are syntactic patterns of varying degrees of schematicity and complexity, then of course the next step is to say, well, couldn't we just describe everything? So not just words, morphemes, and idioms, but also other syntactic phenomena using constructions. And that's what Fillmore and Kay and others started in the 1980s, and Adele Goldberg sort of excellently illustrated in her 1995 book on argument structure constructions, that there is a field where you can clearly use this. So could he shriek himself unconscious? Firefighters cut the man free, have a resultative meaning. So he causes himself to become unconscious by shrieking, and firefighters cause the man to become free by cutting. And it didn't take you more than a second to understand what the sentence meant. But, you know, from a classical rule-based approach, you would say, well, shriek is an intransitive verb. Someone shrieks, it's just a verb of noise emission. How can that have a resultative meaning? And similarly, cut is normally a transitive verb. Someone cuts something, you cut an apple, and then the apple is affected. But in firefighters cut the man free, the man is hopefully not affected, he's not cut. But an object that's backgrounded, the car, is being cut, and he ends up being free. And so for these instances, again, you can use a full meaning pairing. You can have subject, verb, object, and oblique, and that has a corresponding meaning of A causes B to become C by V. So firefighters caused the man to become free by cutting. He shrieked himself to become unconscious by shrieking. Okay. Now that we've seen what constructions are, I just would like to go through the main concepts that are going to be relevant for the talk. Constructions are stored pairings of form and meaning in the mind of a speaker. They're entrenched, and that means they must be in the long-term memory. You must remember what the resultative construction is to use it in the future. Constructs, on the other hand, are specific utterances, what in the olden days was called parole or performance, an actual output that you can sort of then analyze. In many instances, one utterance is going to be a combination of constructions, as we will see. And these have to be assembled somewhere, and this is best explained by the working memory. That's the place where long-term memory information is activated and brought together. And as we will see, constructs play a huge role in creativity. Construction grammar then claims that all levels of description involve four meaning pairings, that there's a network of constructions that explains this, and this network is called the constructicon. It's analogically formed on the lexicon. Because of this, there is a lexicon syntax clan. There is no longer a strict difference between lexicon and syntax. Both involve four meaning pairings, and there is only a difference in schematicity. And finally, usage-based approaches put to the forefront the notion that individual performance is always going to leave an impact on your mind. So competence and performance are closely intertwined. They connect each other. And every time you want to utter something in performance, you've got to activate competence level knowledge. And then once you hear it, it can become part of your competence again. So constructions are acquired in a usage-based perspective via input, so specific usage events with rich contextual clues, and domain general cognitive mechanisms, so pattern finding, schematization, categorization, and so on. How does that work? Well, a very important point from working to long-term memory in the establishment of schemas of more syntax-like constructions is type frequency. So if you have the resultative construction, subject, verb, or in this case, the ditransitive, subject, verb, object, object, he gave her the book. The meaning is an agent causes a recipient to receive a theme by being. That constitutes an argument structure construction of basic human scene, as Goldberg says, for which we've got several constructions. This particular template, this particular four meaning pairing is acquired through input. So there's type frequency, kids here, he gave her a present, they WhatsApped her the dates, she threw him the ball. And from a usage-based perspective, these wouldn't be lost just because you create a schema, but you identify the similarity. There's a process of analogy that sees in all of these, the subject is an agent, the object is a recipient, the first one, and the second object is a theme that the recipient gets in one way or another. So you generalize to this schema. Once you've got the schema, you can, of course, explain creativity, because the schema allows you to establish new instances. So you could also say, he Snapchatted me his holiday pictures, okay? All of these new instances are going to be licensed as abstract construction, but at the same time, there's going to be the entire taxonomy that's important. What I mean by this is that various colleagues have pointed out that the existing exemplars, the existing tokens like give, or WhatsApp and so on in the ditransitive form a cluster of experiences. And Goldberg calls this coverage, and that sort of determines the new elements that you can add to this. Closer your new element to Snapchat someone something is to existing one, like he emailed her the dates, they WhatsApped her the dates, the verbs of communication are very often used. Then the coverage, the existing exemplars are going to help you create a new instance that is similar. At the same time, as important as the novel instances and productivity, there's a certain type of creativity. Leech pointed out already in 1969 that creativity can be seen as making original use of the established possibilities of the language, and that will be using an existing schema and its coverage to get something new. But on top of that, very often speakers will, well, very often, but at least occasionally, speakers and then languages will extend the repertoire of constructions. Think of the progressive construction, which wasn't part of the English language until the early modern English period, or the going to future construction, which also emerged in this period. So sometimes speakers, by one way or another, will be creative and they will extend the existing possibilities. And that's something that I will return to, e-creativity, as Sampson called it. So creativity isn't just slot productivity, but there is fixed creativity, that's Leech's making original use of established possibilities, against enlarging or extending creativity, as Sampson calls it, where you add something new that wasn't in the system. Okay, let's look at the intricacies of constructs and schemas and their relationship. So as I said, in a lot of studies, you get the impression that constructional creativity is equated with productivity. So a schema just gets another instance that it didn't have before. That to a certain degree, the coverage, what is there, explains extension of properties, but we can also see that sometimes the process is more difficult, and there are examples that are going to tell us something about all the factors that come into play. This is one of my favorite constructions. It's the XB naught, the Y as Z in the Q construction. Sometimes you get the feeling that construction grammarians are not too good with coming up with creative names for their own constructions. But if I tell you a couple of examples, you will see where this is heading. So she's not the sharpest tool in the shed, a stuck-up mean girl and not the brightest bulb in the pack. Poor Bill Frisk was not the quickest bunny in the warren. Alexander Bergs, 2018, talked about these examples. And you will no doubt know many others, like not the brightest candle on the cake, and so on. And then you could argue, how are these individual constructs licensed? Well, the construction grammar answer is always going to involve constructions, obviously. So you could say that this construction has a subject slot for a person or a theme. And what you're going to say about this is that it's not very intelligent. Then you've got be not the, which is fixed, an adjective in the superlative, and then a noun in the noun. She's not the brightest candle on the cake. The superlative, and that's important, must be a synonym for intelligent. So sharp, bright, and quick can also in some contexts mean that someone is intelligent. And at the same time, they are part of a frame. The second part, so tool in the shed, bulbs in the pack, and bunnies in the warren, that's an experiential frame. Bunnies are kept in warrens, bulbs come in a pack, and you keep tools in a shed. All of this is fine until you get to examples like, I mean, he's not the brightest lad, is he? Not the shiniest penny in the piggy bank. And this is an interesting example because if you decontextualize it, and I've given it to colleagues, and you say, well, is not the shiniest penny in the piggy bank a good example of the construction? They go like, no, don't get it. If you give them context, it already gets a bit better. So you need to look at the linguistic context. And this tells us something about the networks and their interactions. So we got this construction, it's got an adjective slot, and you will have experienced quickest, sharpest, and brightest in it, all of which are synonyms of intelligent. So of course, these in the constructicon are going to have a horizontal link to intelligent. This is going to be primed, this is going to be part of it. And this horizontal link is important because in many approaches, in many construction grammar approaches, these are sort of intuitively assumed, but we don't talk enough about them. Aldring and Jackendorf recently focused on this notion of horizontal links. Martin Hilpert has talked about it, and many others are starting to talk about it. But if you look at many of the other descriptions of construction grammar, you get the idea that it's mostly just taxonomies, top-down things with schemas going up and more specific examples towards the end. And of course, if we treat the constructicon as something that is psychologically at least plausible, it needs to be a web, a network that's not just spun up and down, but in all sorts of directions. And priming evidence is, of course, supportive of this. So we know that quick, sharp, and bright prime something like intelligent. So there's going to be a horizontal link. At the same time, quick, bunny, and warren, sharp, tool, and shed, bright, bulb, and pack are packaged into a single frame, an experiential frame. So quick, a bunny can be quick, and a tool can be sharp, and a bulb can be bright. So someone who uttered these made the link in the physical, literal meaning of quick, sharp, and bright. And that primes the whole frame, and that means a bunny can be in a warren, tool in a shed, and so on. So you can see how quick, sharp, and bright are a bit like pivots, like anchors. They draw in the meaning of intelligent, but they also give you the second part. And there you can see how the construction, together with a network, already gives you the coverage, to use Adele Goldberg's term. But how do we get to shiniest? Because shiniest is not a synonym for intelligent. So you can't normally say he's very shiny to mean that he's intelligent. He's quick, he's sharp, he's bright, all mean he's intelligent, but he's shiny doesn't work. Pardon me. So what happens here is the specific context. And that again shows that it's not just the constructional network in the long-term memory, but a specific construct and the constructions that are activated by a speaker in their network. In this particular instance, the speaker or the writer had said brightest lad. Okay, he's not the brightest lad. He'd already established the meaning of not very clever. And he used bright for this. Now, bright and not very clever is going to be linked to the not the sharpest tool in the box construction, not the brightest bulb in the pack kind of thing. And that's where you get the schema for this. But then bright is obviously going to be linked to shiny in its literal sense, because something can be bright, something can shine, light emission and visual perception. So that's also going to be triggered. And once you've got this bridging context, once your network is established in that way, you don't just have to rely on coverage, on what the construction would normally do, but the context and the bridging context and the active priming, what the working memory does, activates parts that allows you to come up with something new. That doesn't mean that this isn't an ephemeral example. It could just get lost again, and I don't think many people use it afterwards. But it shows you that in order to do this, the speaker must have activated more than the schema, more than the coverage, and that the wider network is something that we need to look at when we think about linguistic creativity. And this will later on lead us to the question of how is all of this combined? How do speakers do this? What metaphor can we use to describe this process? And I will argue that conceptual blending is the way forward here. Looking at another example of e-creativity, of extending your repertoire. So there's something called #rap, which has come up in the late, in the 2010s, late 2000s. So you've got things like this. I hope this plays out all right. Okay, I hope you could hear it. This was from Drake. And he sings or raps, "I could teach you how to speak my language, Rosetta Stone." You can see why this is called #rap. It's almost got the format of a tweet, right? If you'd tweeted it, if you wrote it on Twitter, you could say, "I could teach you how to speak my language, #Rosetta Stone." And there you could see how something from Twitter sort of influences this. The main ingredients of this structure is you've got a metaphor first. I could teach you how to speak my language, how to think about what I do, how to see the world from my view, and then like Rosetta Stone. And Rosetta Stone in this hashtag is, of course, a reference to the language learning software that's called Rosetta Stone. And this, of course, is a template that hadn't existed before, but this kind of meta comment use from Twitter, the hashtag, was introduced into rap. And you can find other examples like "Swimming in the Money, Come and Find Me," Nemo, like the movie Nemo. I guess I'll leave that question to the experts, assuming that there are some out there. They're probably alone. Solitaire. Solitaire is a card game that you play alone. And that's sort of like the meta comment or the theme by which you have to interpret what he said before. I would argue that not all of these are equally creative, or they don't. I'm not a huge expert on rap, but 5, is more intuitive for me than 7. I can see that there's a meaning behind all of them, but I'm not too much in the speech community to understand all of them in depth. But you can see that this statement, Paul's punchline, and the punchline is, of course, like a meta comment or a meta commentary from a hashtag from Twitter, as McCulloch has pointed out, brings together many pieces of information and asks you to interpret this. And once the pattern is established, you can, of course, use it like a constructional schema. And the schema is going to be very abstract. You've got to make some kind of statement, leave a little pause, and then have something that's like a meta comment on this. More often than not, a short noun phrase. This is, of course, e-creative because that kind of pattern wasn't there in the spoken language and in rap. It draws on perhaps written language as well as sort of other common functions. You could argue that some might have said it's like a simile where the like has been deleted by a speaker. I would assume it's got multiple inputs, but as you can see, the very first time someone did this, they created a construct that wasn't part of the language, and then it got picked up as a model by, for example, Dawn and other people. Okay, another example, and now we're sort of heading towards Big C. That's from the Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll. "'Twas brillig and the slithy shows, the gyre and gimble and the wabe, all mimsy where the borogroves and the momraths outgrabe." There's tons of novel words in there that Carroll invented, a brillig, slithy, wabe, and so on. So to a certain degree, it's e-creative, though Bergs and Comper have argued that you can never really be fully e-creative, because if you came up with something that was not in the language at all, it's gibberish. And even if you think about the novel words that Carroll comes up with, like brillic and toves, it follows the phonotactic rules of English, right? So the onsets and the rhymes are similar to other constructions. So toves and groves, for example, rhymes. And so toves has got a perfectly acceptable syllable structure. And you could argue, therefore, that it's not 100% e-creative. I personally think that is too strict a criterion for e-creativity. I think by giving new constructions, new words in the long-term memory, the constructicon is extended. And I would, from a construction grammar perspective, argue that the notion of extending the constructicon by adding a new construction to the network, you've already done something that is e-creative, if it's not the productive use of an existing schema. Okay, if you look at this, you can still understand it because there's also some fixed creativity about this. So it was brillic, you understand, because it's an old form for it was X. So that's a predicate B construction. You get the slizy toes, the gyre and gimbal in the wave. Something moves somewhere. So that's the intransitive motion construction. All mimsy where the borogroves, X is Y, another predicate B construction. And the mom rests are grave. The mom rests has got a plural marking on the rest, so whatever the refs are, they're in plural, it's a noun phrase. And they did something which was outgraving, so it's an intransitive construction. So this sort of, to a certain degree, supports Bergs and Comper's view that, you know, you can never be fully creative, because that would be like the bird's seed on the keyboard and the bird's picking away, it would be gibberish. But you rely on templates here, schemas, which you fill via F creativity. But I think you also extend certain elements. You create new words. That's what Carroll does here. And sort of this is also e-creative, as I would argue. It already shows that the field of linguistic creativity not only sort of is important for cognitive grammar and construction grammar and all kind of syntactic analyses. It will touch upon at one point on areas which are also of importance to literary studies. And I don't claim that I'm a literary scholar, but all that we do as linguists is offer a framework that perhaps is of interest to literary scholars. And many working in cognitive poetics, experts on that kind of thing, can relate to the terminology and the cognitive approach of construction grammar. So this really should be seen as an offer for discussion for interdisciplinary work. And in no way, shape or form am I implying that I'm doing literary work or that I can do the work of cognitive poetics. But this is one part where I would hope construction grammar in its perspective could help sort of as a tool and as a starting point for interdisciplinary discussion. When you look at creativity beyond schematization, you also got to look at multimodal communication. We know this more than ever because our abilities to communicate, as we see right now via Zoom and other technical means across the world, has increased. Teenagers from a very young age on communicate via Snapchat, Instagram, and TikTok. So these multimodal packages are important. They always were important because face-to-face communication is also a multimodal package of another person's facial expression, of their gestures, of the ground that you have, and lots of things which gesture studies have pointed out. But just to illustrate sort of with hopefully funny, but at the same time highly complicated example, what goes into this and how we should approach this, I'm going to show you a short clip. I'm not endorsing the product per se. It's just about the linguistic and visual combination.
权了，来条 Snickers。兄弟，怎么样？来劲了。You're not you when you're hungry. Snickers, get some nuts.
Okay, as I said, all chocolate bars are good. Don't eat too much of them. But what I want to focus on here is that you just watched this. And I don't think at no point in time did you have problems understanding what was going on, nor did you stop. Because, I mean, there's weird stuff going on if you look at it from a computational perspective, right? If you did facial recognition, then what would happen? I hope I can get to the element. Then the computer would tell you that at this point, there's an actor called Rowan Atkins in the scene down with the other samurais. And then, after eating a chocolate bar, you know, there's a camo trick there, which gives you a different perspective. And there's a cut to the scene. You see a samurai who's fully competent. But I'm pretty sure that none of you went like, whoa, what's going on? Where's Mr. Bean disappeared to? What's the samurai doing now? The moment you saw the guy holding the Snickers bar, you assumed that it was the old Mr. Bean character. You processed this immediately. And from a cognitive perspective, cognitive blending, conceptual blending is what is happening here. And we'll talk about this in a second. But I just want to focus also on the language. You're not you when you're hungry. If we just look at this truth semantically, right? You are not you. That doesn't compute. It's a meaningless sentence, or at least it should be to a computer. We're not computers. We don't work like that. We understand immediately what is the intention behind you're not you when you're hungry, that there's an abstract ideal of you being at your fittest, and when you're hungry, you're a bit tired and you're not as fast and not as fit, and that's why, you know, you're not the whole full fit self that you could be, okay, but you're always the same self. It's a complex thought. It's one that we as humans can entertain because we can blend these different mental spaces. Of course, mental spaces, and it's very important, is a tribute to Gilles Fauconnier, who unfortunately passed away earlier this year, a great loss to the community, a brilliant linguist who gave us the notion of mental spaces, which are going to be highly important for everything that we build on. So you can see that these mental spaces are there, they pop up, and you're able to unify them. And as Fauconnier and Turner said, you blend them into one. From a construction grammar perspective, just to focus on this a bit more, of course, you're not you. The first time you said it wasn't a construction. It wasn't stored in your mental grammar. But you and the X is Y construction and not construction. All of this was there. You put it together and you said you're not you. Where is all of this happening? As I will argue throughout, in the working memory. That's where constructions are combined, verbal as well as visual. And constructions are the long-term memories, the chunks and the schematas that you have in your entrenched mind. This looks simple at first. So you've got long-term memory information, you activate it, put it together, and you get the construct. But if you think about how fast the processing of all the information was that you had in the clip, in the ad, then you will understand that there's lots of information that we can package into a single meaning. And the verbal and the visual are clearly just one packet of this. You don't separate this and process it independently. It gives you one specific meaning, which of course is supposed to be by the chocolate bar, or if you are more literally minded, you're not you when you're hungry. This can be achieved via conceptual blending. And because we need conceptual blending here, I would follow Mark Turner and others in arguing, well, if we need conceptual blending here, maybe conceptual blending is the way forward to put together constructions in the working memory all the time. So there is no other combinatory mechanism. The mind doesn't unify. It's not just purely constraint based, and all of the other metaphors that you have. And it's not just combine, it's not just merge. That's the important bit. So every day we use lots of metaphors. So Messi is the Mozart of football, brevity is the soul of wit, LeBron James is the Meryl Streep of basketball, or Donald Trump is the Meryl Streep of having thin skin. And these, from a cognitive perspective, using conceptual blending, can be explained by two input spaces, and in blending we can have more of two, obviously. So one input space is Mozart, everything you know about him, the frame, 18th century composer, brilliant, genius, died very young. Maybe you've got knowledge about him because of the movie, the Schaffer movie. Scheffer play and the movie based on Scheffer's play. And then you've got Messi, who's obviously one of the best footballers of all time. And that's one input space. And you compress this into Messi's a genius of football. And the interesting thing about this is, I mean, there's an analogy, there's two participants, two individuals, Mozart and Messi, in the two spaces. And you blend the football thing from Messi and the genius thing from Mozart, but you do not take, you're selective in your projection, as Turner and Fauconnier say, because you do not take anything like 18th century or music into the blend. You do, if Messi is the Mozart of football, you're not saying that Messi is a great musician. I wouldn't know. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't, but that's not what you're saying. So it's selective projection, and you get a new idea. That's the basic important point. So you can take old ideas and squeeze new ideas out of them and be creative. Now, as we will see, the X is the Y of Z by now is, of course, a constructional template. And you have many instances like that where people use it. But originally, for the first time, it must have drawn on this blending process. If we then just sort of scratch on the surface of you're not you when you're hungry, then of course there's the visual and there's the language. And in the visual, what you do is you get Mr. Bean and his clumsiness and everything you know about him, and you get a samurai, which is very competent, skillful, masterful, different eras and so on. And you're able to blend these. So from Mr. Bean at the start, when the samurai is still hungry, you take the clumsiness, he eats something, he's no longer hungry. Of course, you also project an ad frame where you know that they're trying to sell you the Snickers bar. But just linguistically, you can also see that there's a predicative B construction. You are you, X is Y. There's a biological urge frame to be hungry and a neat frame that changes the state. Everything you know encyclopedically about being hungry and then eating something. You've got negation and you got the U input space. And that's blended into something. If you're hungry, you're not well, but if you eat, you will feel better. And you're not you when you're hungry means you're not your perfect self. So this involves many different input spaces, and the visual is going to come on top of that. And this is a highly creative aspect again, and I would argue that in the working memory, therefore, we combine the visual and the linguistic. And a lot of this is not going to have to do with a term I shall use later, multimodal constructions. So gesture, verb, verbal as packages that are stored with a specific meaning, but there's going to be visual information, gesture information, and language information, which creatively you package together using conceptual blending. Let's just look at gesture studies a bit in more detail to see what I'm getting at. Okay, look at the following example.
Michelle Obama wowed in white at last night's state dinner. The First Lady of Style stole the show with a strapless ivory gown custom made by designer Brandon Maxwell. The dress got big approval ratings from the president.
Okay, so you can see that Obama does the thumbs up gesture. It's a cultural specific one. And because in some cultures, you know, biting your thumb or having the thumb up is not positive, but in Western cultures, in many Western cultures, it's a sign of approval, of being supportive. And if you've got a constructional template, you know, because you know it's conventional for a specific community, it can be stored, and it's going to be a unimodal gesture construction. So it has properties on the form level, but in this case, it's going to be gesture parts, and it's going to be linked to a meaning. So we can fit it into a constructional template, of course. This one is going to be stored. It's a unimodal construction that has the gesture properties. And I'm using Bressham's notation scheme here, that the thumb, that's the one, is stretched. The palm is normally lateral. And then this, on the semantic level, it means something like good, yes, or approval. And pragmatically, you use it to show support and create report with an addressee. So that's clearly another type of construction, but it's unimodal. It's a gesture construction. There's a few of them, but not as many as there are verbal construction, because we are the verbal species, and spoken language, of course, dominates in our societies, though we, of course, have specific sign languages which people have created for people who are impaired with respect to their hearing, and they use that to communicate. And these are fully developed linguistic systems that work in the same way, and where you can also apply the notion of constructions in this sense, where a specific gesture is going to be linked to a specific meaning. The one that I just signaled is "I love you" in American Sign Language, I hope. Okay. Now, whenever construction grammarians sort of think about phenomenon, they always think about it in terms of constructions. So if there are unimodal gesture constructions, and if there are unimodal verbal constructions, what about multimodal constructions? And the jury is still out on those. Not a lot have been found. Landwehr, Schoenjens, and Siemer argue for multimodal constructions, mostly because from a usage-based perspective, right? We take in a specific token, a specific exemplar in its rich contextual situation, and that means gesture, position of the speaker, and everything. Some of this information, like all information that we store, can get lost if it doesn't get reactivated, but at first it could be stored. So if it happens very often, it could become part of a multimodal construction package. Ningelin and Auer are more skeptical, and so is Alexander Ziem, because they argue that most of the instances are a combination of a unimodal construction on the gesture level with a unimodal verbal construction, and they're just put together on the fly. And I find this more interesting than anything else, because most people sort of stop at this. And I would argue that these multimodal constructs, the ones that are not stored, from the aspect of creativity, from the aspect of what's going on in the working memory, how we combine the verbal and the gestural, is actually the most important and the most fascinating bit. Which is why I argue that one focus of constructional research should focus more on these online full-meaning pairs, as I call them, the online constructions that are created in the working memory by building constructs. I would call this constructionalization, but Elizabeth Traugott and Graham Trousel have already sort of copyrighted the term for linguistic change, and it's slightly different. So let's use online full-meaning pairs and constructs for this notion. Multimodal constructs can become multimodal constructions. They can become entrenched, and frequency and salience, like for all other constructions, are going to be important. But at the same time, gesture use has been shown to be based on inter-individual differences, psychology, the big 5 traits, which we're going to look at towards the end. So, as I said, what I want to focus on more is on the creative aspect in the working memory, where something is combined that isn't a construction yet. One thing where I did a study on multimodal construction grammar or multimodal construct grammar is comparative correlatives. So you have sentences like, the more complex the topic, the longer the talk, the more you eat, the fatter you get, the more the merrier. Pardon me. These are known as comparative correlative constructions. They consist of 2 clauses. The first clause has a comparative phrase, more complex, and then a clause, the topic is, and then a second clause, the longer comparative phrase, the talk is, and there's a relationship between the 2. So the first one is the independent variable, or a protasis, that causes the second, the dependent variable, in the apodosis. So if you eat more, the effect is, the cause is, you're going to get fatter. So semantically, there is an interesting symmetric as well as asymmetric relationship in this construction. The 2 clauses clearly have an asymmetric relationship because one causes the other. Cause and effect, protasis, apodosis. On the other hand, the comparative part of it, so the more you eat, the fatter you get, clause internally, have a similar semantics, sort of putting it very simply, because both assume that you conjure up a time span during which something increases or decreases. So the more you eat means there's a start and an end, and during that period, your eating increases. And the fatter you get, it's a time frame, start and finish, and your weight is going to increase. It doesn't always have to be increase. The more you own, the less happy you are, but it's the same semantics of start and end, and a comparative change. So the construction has symmetric and asymmetric properties, and it started out early Middle English period, some predecessors in the Old English period, as an asymmetric construction that was marked differently with respect to word order and other elements in the first and the second clause. And then for various changes in the English language, subject-verb order that was fixed for main and subordinate clauses, they became more and more similar. So to cut a long story short, the history of the comparative correlative in English is one from a more asymmetrically, formally marked construction to a more symmetrically marked one. But at the same time, semantically, you still have these two things: a symmetric, where the first and the second construction clause are interpreted in the same way, as well as an asymmetric relationship where one is cause and the other is effect. Now, once you've got a construction like that that combines these things, it's of course interesting to see how speakers conceptualize this using gestures, how they create multimodal constructs. This is from a TED talk.
Because whether they'd meant to or not, my parents left behind a very clear message. The less you own, the more you have.
So she says, the less you own, the more you have. The left hand is lex and flat, palm towards center, and it moves away from the center on the first clause. And then in the second clause, you get a symmetric gesture, but this time to the other side. And that's the right hand, palm to center, hand lex flat, and then the hand moves like this. I should probably go like this, okay? So you can see she splits up the construction into two parts. First clause, second clause. There is a symmetric relationship about it, but at the same time, they move in different directions. So you could argue that this type of gesture also implies the kind of difference between the two. So this kind of message conveys symmetric as well as asymmetric properties in the gesture which fits the constructional description. But is that a multimodal construction? Is it entrenched not just in an individual, which is hard enough to find out, but maybe also conventionalized in a speech community? I would argue it's more of a gesticulation. Gesticulation and gesture studies are meaningful gestures which obligatorily need to accompany verbal language. Think back again to the thumbs up gesture. I can do this and not say anything, and if you know the conventional meaning of it, you know what I'm trying to express. If I do this, however, it could mean tons of things. It could mean on the one hand, on the other hand, some say this, some say that. So it's compatible with multiple meanings. So there is something spontaneous, individual about it, and you need the language, the multimodal construct to interpret it. They are rarely conventionalized, however. So if they were conventionalized, then it would be a multimodal construction. So I don't know, oh, you can't see this with my blue jumper. I don't know. So the shrug, Alan Schenke has worked on this and said that very often people say, I don't know, they've got a shoulder shrug that accompanies that. And if that always happens or very often, then it's going to be tied into a multimodal construction. But many are not. So how do people construct these multimodal packages? And as I'm sort of saying over and over again, there's more to construction grammar than just constructions, which seems counterintuitive because most construction grammar publications say construction X, construction Y, and language X, Y, Z. These are still important. Long-term associations of form and meaning are important constructions, but we also need to think more about how they are combined. So in order to look at the comparative correlative construction, I need a large corpus, and for this I drew on the red hen corpus that Mark Turner and Francis Steen and others are working on. It's a large television corpus. By now it's got more than 2 billion words of television news. Television news are not sort of just one type of program, because sometimes you also have chat shows on that in the corpus. You have ads, you have people being interviewed spontaneously, but you've also got sort of media pros like news reporters and anchors talking about stuff. But the size is really impressive. If I looked at comparative correlative constructions, the more you eat, the fatter you get. In classical corpora like the Brown corpus and its relatives, which has got 1 million words each, then for every 1 million word corpus, you only find 40 instances of the comparative correlative construction. And that's the same for the ICE, British English corpus, frown, flob, you name it. You always get roughly 35, 40, whatever, but sort of roughly around this point. I extracted 1,000 tokens from this particular corpus. Not all of them were relevant, but we're going to end up with way more than you would find in a 1 million word corpus. The query is on that. It uses CQP, the interface that Peter Ulrich has developed. And you could look at potentially more than 30,000 hits in more than 29,000 texts. But all in all, I ended up with this random sample of 1,000 tokens, out of which 442 were unique relevant tokens, because some were repeated. If you had a rerun of a show, then it would come up twice. And I wasn't interested because I wanted to look at the spontaneous gesture. So each individual instance of a TV show that was repeated was only taken into account once. Now, in those 442 instances, very often, just like right now, you can't see my hands. You didn't see the hands of the speaker because they were below the screen, or there was like on-screen text blocking the view. But then in 100 of those, you could see a gesture, or you could see the hands, and in 80% of those, there was a gesture, and in 20% there was no gesture. So if you look at this, then of course it's not necessarily the case that there's one multimodal comparative correlative construction stored. But people seem to have the urge to gesture with this construction, and that's, I would argue, is already an interesting point for further investigation. When you then look at what they do, and these are just three broad categories, you can see that speakers sometimes have a parallel gesture, which seems to focus on the symmetric part of C1 and C2.
You're doing okay, and the more of us who talk about it, the easier it will get, because
the more of us who talk about it, the easier we'll get. Both palms are sort of open and facing slightly upwards. There's an arc movement outside. On both of these clauses, you see the symmetrical element. Then you get gestures which are symmetric.
Ask your advisor. He knows a lot, and the more he's afraid, the more he's going to talk.
The more he's afraid, the more he's going to talk. So both hands sort of facing each other and towards the center, the palms are lateral, and he moves to his left and then to his right. In a similar sense, there's a similar gesture on both of the clauses, but they're going in opposite directions. So you can see this asymmetric relationship between the two. But sometimes you also get so-called asymmetric relationships where people don't do the same gesture on both clauses, and they don't have a symmetric gesture, but the hands do something different, totally different, as in this example.
Did you know that the more stress you have, the more likely you are to be obese? And the proof here is in strands of your hair.
Okay, so let no one take your hair. But apart from that, on the first clause, the more stress you have, she has a beat gesture where the rhythm is beat with her index finger. And then on the second clause, the more likely you are to be obese. Both hands are sort of stretched and palm lateral towards center, and you still got a beating gesture to the right. Something completely different. Very broad categories. But just to show you, the symmetric ones where people did the same gesture on the first and second clause are rare, some like 10% of the examples. And in 40%, you got a parallel gesture. So the hands were similar, but moving in different directions. And a different gesture was identified in, again, more than 40%. So the gestures are highly varied. But what happens is, in the linguistic form, the more you eat, the more you gain weight. You get a symmetrical marking of first and second clause in English. And in the gestures, at least, you sort of separate them with respect to a either parallel or different movement. So there is at least this kind of tendency. But the gestures vary far too frequently for us to argue that there is one multimodal construction. And I would argue that's not a problem for construction grammar. That's not something we're going to go, oh, it's not a construction, so we don't have to worry about it anymore. No, on the other, completely contrary to this, because if it's not stored, people must do this on the fly. They must combine the semiotic meaning that they want to express in a gesture as well as in a construction. So conceptual blending offers us with a tool, a cognitive tool for analyzing this. For the cognitive semiotic processes in the working memory, where existing constructions and spontaneous gestures blend in a creative way. It's going to be motivated by cognitive semiotic principles, as Mittelberg points out, metonymy, analogy, and so on. So it's not like we can't explain these, but there's going to be individual instances, and it shows us how thinking blends into these multimodal constructs. And if conceptual blending is so important for the integration of multimodal constructs, it's of course the next step, and Mark Turner and Gilles Fauconnier have published lots of papers on that have shown that you can use conceptual blending to explain novel thoughts, to explain mathematical reasoning. So if that's sort of like a domain general principle, a domain general process, then perhaps it's also a domain general process that is at work in the working memory whenever we combine constructions. So in computational approaches, as I said, you sometimes get the metaphor of unification, combination, however you want to call it. But perhaps that's not the best way to think about this. You've got a complex thought, and what you do is you blend all the gestural and the verbal information from your long-term memory that you put into this construct that you want to express. So they were able to cut the turtle loose, of course, blends in lots of constructions. And if we were to disentangle them, we don't very often do this, but you know, there's a they construction, turtle loose construction. It's again a resultative. They cut the turtle loose, and then it's past tense and be able to construction and so on. And the turtle is a noun phrase, so it's definite. You need to know which turtle they're talking about. All of this is part of what's fed into the working memory and which is combined there using conceptual blending. And this is, of course, for construction grammar, it's important because constructs are an important window on creative online semiosis of how we combine things into these packages of you are not you when you're hungry in the ad, or in the less you own, the more you have. That's, I think, where it was, with the gesture descriptions. Okay, so as I said, and hopefully now it makes a lot more sense what I'm trying to say, it's not the case that it's just constructions. Okay, constructions play a huge role, but their combination, their creative conceptual blending very often is going to be important too. And if you adopt like a computational approach and a complete inheritance approach in construction grammar, very often, you know, you're only going to have a few constructions and they will combine in a certain way, but you leave out the usage-based aspect of what frequency and specific situations do. And in contrast to this, in usage-based approaches, very often we focus too much on what an individual token does, and then it gets stored, and we talk about constructions being stored from the input. But we leave too little space for online constructs in the working memory, which are, however, really important. Okay, so we've seen this with gesture constructions and multimodal constructions, but of course, from a usage-based perspective, once something is novel and useful, appropriate, so to speak, then people might pick it up. Take a look at this.
Small startup businesses like that hold a special place in America's heart, and politicians from across the political spectrum love to talk about how important they are.
Small business is the backbone of the American economy.
Okay, so what Hillary Clinton said is small business is the backbone of our economy. From a conceptual blending perspective, it's X is the YZ frame that you bring to this, and in this one frame that you blend into the construct is, of course, small business and economy, the economy frame. So X and Y, small business, economy, come from the same frame, and X and Z, pardon me, and the Y, the backbone, that comes from a different domain, a physical domain. You have a backbone consisting of your vertebrae, and it gives you shape and sort of structure and stability. And then this piece of information, the stability, is blended into the resulting blended space, and small business is the backbone of our economy means that small businesses are important for the whole structure of our economy. You got this, it wasn't difficult, the construction is already entrenched. But this specific construct, small business is the backbone of our economy, is perhaps something that you hadn't heard. Now that's a specific token of use, but if this particular F creative instance was said for the first time and someone thought, well, unconsciously of course, well, that's something that we could use again, then it can become a construction that's used over and over again. Take a look at this.
Small business is the backbone of the American economy.
Small businesses are the backbone of this nation's economy.
Small businesses are the backbone of our economy. Small businesses are the backbone of small businesses are the backbone of our economy. Small businesses are the backbone of our economy. Small businesses are the backbone of our economy.
It's true. Small businesses are the backbone of our economy.
So there you can see politicians thought that that's a neat statement and they recycled it, and then it conventionalized in the political speech community. But that again separates two things, right? It separates the individual creative aspect when this construct was combined for the first time using an existing construction. It's F creative. It definitely wasn't E creative. It's but at least, you know, it's a new instance of this X is the Y of Z schema that wasn't there before. But once it's out there in a speech community, it can become deemed appropriate, it can become conventionalized, and then other individuals are also going to entrench it. And this is a whole other story, and Barbara Dunziger and others have looked at how sort of memes and other things sort of spread in a society, and that's another area, memes, the individual creation of those in pop culture, which I think construction grammar could bring a lot to. But my focus will be on the original creation of those, the kind of aspects that blend into this. But there is, of course, also the aspect of how does this spread? How is it deemed appropriate, and which speech community picks it up to what degree? So here we get a construct that was deemed novel and appropriate, and then it was stored as a construction. Okay. We're approaching the end. So far, I talked a lot about the constructional networks in the long-term memory and how they're activated for constructs in the working memory, and how blending plays a huge role for this. But for any individual creative construct, the appropriateness is important, and that needs or assumes someone who evaluates a construct. And we know from decades of social linguistic research that language is a social phenomenon. And it's spoken in a social context. It can be an online speech community like we are right now, or on Twitter, an abstract internet community, or TikTok, or it can be in a face-to-face conversation between friends, hopefully very soon when this horrible pandemic is over. And this shows that it's not just the networks in our mind that are important here. Martin Hilpert at the last International Conference of Cognitive Linguistics in Japan pointed out that there's the Lennon and McCartney type of creativity, where like two geniuses are popping ideas back and forth and together they create something novel. And I think that's a very useful idea of thinking about this. But of course, not all of us are Lennon and McCartney. But you get the idea that working together, that sometimes a creative construct isn't just something that pops out of a single individual's head. In language change, Trousdale and Traugott and many others have pointed out that constructs, when a progressive is interpreted for the first time as ongoing, or the going to future is interpreted for the first time as implying future, and this becomes semanticized and not just movement in space, that this happens in an individual, but it also requires the context where this happens. And so I would focus on the social networks and the linguistic and physical context as well. I really hope you can hear the videos, because for the next part, it's very important. This is from a show called QI. It's a panel show that's allegedly not scripted, but of course, these are professional comedians, or at least people who are well sort of experienced with being on TV. This, for example, is Brian Cox, a famous physics professor. And in this part, they talk about the moons of Saturn. Okay? They talked about the ring of Saturn earlier, and now they're talking about the moons. This is about 10 minutes into the show.
Of all these moons, like this is the one thing I wanted to ask you. Of all these moons, which one's most likely to be the home to Ewoks?
Titan has got a thicker atmosphere than the Earth, so you'd need to be furry.
Okay, so they're talking about astronomy and about Saturn and moons. And the other comedian comes up with the idea of, well, if it's in space, then for him that triggers Ewoks and of course the entire sci-fi series of Star Wars. And then they talk about, well, which planet, if you could host Ewoks, and Brian Coxton says Titan. For now, it's just important that we've established a frame where Titan and Ewoks is a thing.
Of all these moons.
And then about 15 minutes later, where they talked about lots of other stuff, this is going to be relevant again. Okay, this is what I mean by discourse, context, and different individuals working together to create something novel and a novel interpretation. I guess you're all adults. There's a bit of implicit sexual content here. It's just verbal, but trigger warning for anyone who needs that. But it's the usual kind of British banter that you get. But don't be scared by the language. Okay.
The surface of Saturn's moon Titan, that's so cold that it's got liquid methane. Liquid
Titan's the one where the Ewoks live.
Titan, yes.
You see? So basically, you're saying you can shatter an Ewok?
Yes, because it's got lakes of liquid methane. Wow. Because it's so cold. And the methane behaves exactly like water on Earth. So you get rain, methane rain, you get methane snow, methane ice, and lakes of methane. There's a lake there which is as large as Lake Superior.
Methane, which is essentially a fart, liquid fart.
Yes, exactly.
You know, if I could stand on a planet and throw an Ewok into a lake of fart, that'd just be...
Well, you couldn't, because it'd shatter. So you wouldn't.
We'd be tossing Ewoks into a lake of fart. That is... Oh,
when you say tossing Ewoks into a lake,
that's exactly what I meant.
Okay. Let's look at how this evolved. So 10 minutes into the show, they were talking about Saturn and the moons, and Titan was really cold and Ewoks could live there. Just before this part of the conversation, 15 minutes later, they talked about nitrogen, how cold it is, that you could dip a rose in it and then it would shatter. And that led Professor Cox to talk about Titan again, because it's so cold there, that you could also dip a rose there and it would shatter. Now, if you look at how this unfolds, then he talks about Titan again, and he says there's a lake, and Sue Perkins, the comedian to his left, she points out, well, methane, that for her triggers the domain of, well, it smells of a fart, of a flatulence, so like liquid fart. And then Ross Noble, the other comedian, the longer comedian, brings up the Ewoks again, and says, well, a lake of fart, or then a fart lake. So that's entertained for a couple of seconds, this blended idea. But then he moves on and he talks about tossing Ewoks into a lake of fart. And what he wants to do is physically throw them. I don't know why. Apparently it was funny, like throwing a fictional character into this lake of methane. But the point is, so this is a back and forth. This is the context, this is the setup that spans more than 15 minutes. And Ewoks on Titan wasn't a thing before this show, because there are no Ewoks, spoiler alert, and there is no life on Titan. So that's a blended concept that was entertained in this show. And then Ross Noble uses that and says, well, then I could be tossing Ewoks into a lake of fart. When he said that, he had the meaning of physical throwing. Now, Professor Cox, on the other hand, because there is a sexual meaning of to toss, which I don't have to go into, you probably know it. But he picks up on that and he's smart. He doesn't even say it, but just by his gesture, and he turns a bit red, and his laughter, you get the idea that, oh, he's referring, in his mind, he made the connection of to toss is not just physical, but it also got this sexual meaning. And then Ross Noble says, that's exactly what I meant, sort of picking up the second meaning and activating that in his mind. And that's then the meaning of this construct. And this is highly dynamic. You know, tossing Ewoks into a lake of fart didn't have this sexual connotation at first, not intentionally, but through the interaction. And earlier in the show, they were talking about sexual content of sorts. So all of this is blended into this specific instance. But it's not just Brian Cox, Professor Cox, that comes up with this. Okay, it's the interaction between the individuals, the banter, and the discourse context, what they have talked about, and the novel ideas that they've introduced into this. Schematically, so you could say, first, Professor Cox talked about methane on Titan and its physical properties. The comedian Perkins picked up on methane and smell, and then you had this idea, this triggers fart and fart lake and so on. which leads Ross Noble to talk about throw an Ewok into a fart lake, which is a construct that ends up at Professor Cox's end. And he then, in his mind, makes the network connection. Oh, toss also has this other meaning. And that's then thrown back. And Noble picks up on that. Okay, so it's not just, when we think about linguistic creativity, we shouldn't just think about the individual linguistic genius sitting at home and penning down a poem. This is also Shakespeare kind of creativity, but he will also have activated lots of scripts and lots of ideas in his mind, like an internal discourse, and he will have been affected by what other people say. So it's very important that we understand that, yes, you could talk about the big C creativity of one individual doing something fantastic. But when it comes to linguistic creativity, very often it's going to be this interaction in a discourse, in a specific situation, where constructs are interpreted and reinterpreted by speakers and hearers. And this is nothing new. This is something that I think historical linguistics and diachronic construction grammar has long focused on, but which I think from the perspective of creativity is also something that we need to take on board. Okay, we're getting towards the end. The final bit, it's very short because I'm not a psychologist, but that's the important bit where we know that individuals are not similar. As I said, generative grammar, like cognitive grammar, focuses so much on the homogeneity, the ideal speaker and hearer, that we all have the same mind, so to speak, and that's why we all are native speakers of a tongue. But of course, we know that individuals differ, and psychological research has shown that factors like openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So neuroticism, how much you are sort of feel blue and dislike situations, or whether you're a brave person. Agreeableness, how much you are unconsciously sort of striving to please other people, or whether you are less agreeable and sort of just do your own thing. Extroversion, how much you enjoy experience around people, socializing. Conscientiousness means how much you stick to details and rules, how important that is to you. And openness is, of course, whether you're open to ideas, new ideas, whether you come up with new ideas, or whether you are just sort of not very open and you stick to what you already know. And again, these factors are going to be important. If you think about it, they're part of your cognitive setup. They influence the processing in your mind, in your brain, and that's going to influence your constructional networks. And there are, of course, studies that have shown that openness and extroversion, as well as general and specific intelligence, correlate significantly with verbal creativity, the number of new items you can come up with in a spontaneous experiment, how funny people think your spontaneous jokes are, and so on. But from a construction grammar perspective, that's going to be important, because we would have to take and collaborate with psychologists to think a bit more about, well, do these people who are high in openness, some people have argued that that means that they are less inhibited, with respect to the connections they make. Maybe these are the people who are open to connections of constructions, like not the shiniest penny in the piggy bank, that other people might not have thought of. That everyone sort of has networks that are at least roughly similar, because we all have a similar experience with our language. But for some people, the strength of the connections is not the only thing. They're able to sort of jump to connections which might not be that strong for other people, because they're less inhibited to the entrenched routes to go. And that is something where we need to collaborate with psychologists, because maybe if you are higher in openness, you rely on fewer entrenched constructions as well. You're going to have prefabs, you're going to have constructions because it's really convenient and there's social interaction with it, but it's at least an interesting hypothesis. And extroversion is important because that means you go out and you meet more people, and the more people you meet from a usage-based perspective means you get more input, and the more input you get, that also should affect your constructional network. So the findings that extroversion and openness are significant when it comes to creativity are not surprising, and I think they can be incorporated into construction grammar. And there is also, some first studies on personality types and multimodal constructs, though Hofstede and Pothoff don't necessarily call it multimodal constructs, but they're interested in multimodal utterances. And they have shown that extroversion and neuroticism positively correlate with a certain type of gesture, for example. So that's a big field that could be explored. Okay, breathe in, breathe out. We're almost there. The bottom line is, it's complicated, but fascinating. So what we have is individuals that talk to each other, that come together, and some of them are going to meet more regularly. Well, because you've got these social networks and they're going to be important. The social networks are important for who you talk to, your communicative goals, your shared knowledge that you can draw on in a specific situation, and also the types of experiences you make. In all of these situations, you've got individuals with individual minds processing their information. And all these individuals, of course, have got individual constructicons. They've got constructions in their long-term memory, and on the fly, they also create creative constructs. So if someone for the first time said, firefighters cut the man free, and he's cut in the resultative construction here, it's probably conventionalized by now. You're going to find it on the web more than once, but there must have been, you know, there's no regressors ad infinitum. There must be a starting point when someone first combined this. They did this in their mind by activating several constructions. There's a resultative construction, there's a verb cut construction that we've got here, there's a firefighter in the plural construction, man and free, and a definite noun phrase construction. And we don't have to go into the details here, but all of these must have been brought to this construct when someone said it for the first time. Then what happens is when this construct is then combined and uttered, it arrives at the other people's minds and brains, is processed, and it leaves a memory trace. This memory trace can then sort of disappear, but if it's deemed very appropriate, and that means this particular token has a high salience, think small businesses are the backbone of our economy. For politicians, when they heard it, for ulterior motives or not, you know how politicians are, but for them it was a useful thing to say. So it also got stuck in the other people's minds, and then they used it as a construction. But from a construction grammar perspective, I would argue it's this incipient point of when the first construct was created in the individual mind, but in a setting where someone was talking to, or at least imagining, writing to an imagined community. On Twitter, you know, when you write something, you imagine who's going to read this. So this interaction is always going to be part of that. Okay, I would argue, and so have many other people, that construction grammar is a successful cognitive grammar model of grammar, and perhaps of language, but bigger than just grammar. Construction grammar also offers a cognitive framework for creative multimodal semiosis, for when something happens for the first time in a speaker's mind, or in a hearer's mind. I would argue that our focus on online semiosis and the creative working memory constructs also brings something new to us. It's something that, not under this label, but for a long time has been carried out in historical linguistics, in diachronic construction grammar. It's important for multimodal construction grammar. It's important for creative constructs. And I think it gives us a better idea if we as usage-based linguists also worry about the creative usage-based aspect in the working memory, and do not just focus on all the stuff that's already stored in a mind. It's important. It provides sort of the stepping stone, the foundation of everything, but there's more to construction grammar than just constructions, is how I would put it. And finally, there are still many open questions. You know, how do these creative constructions arise in the social processes? Which cognitive processes are at work here? And I think there's much more work to be done from this perspective. Also, how and when do creative constructs become constructions? This spreading. So that's also something that I think we could focus on. It's not what I'm most fascinated about right now, but it's an important part of constructional variation and change. And which speakers and which hearers are more creative than others, perhaps. So this individual psychological aspect is something which we could bring to the discussion, and where construction grammar, I think, could offer an interdisciplinary discussion point for psychologists. Okay, you're probably going to have this video online later, so you can pause the various references. I'm not sure whether I even got all of them, but these are the most important ones. And that's me done then. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I look very much forward to your questions. Okay, as far as I know, I got to close the PowerPoint now. And hopefully the transmission was successful and Jogo is able to relate a couple of questions.
Yes, thank you very much. Professor Hoffmann was quite successful and also fascinating and also challenging. definitely complicated, as I said. Well, I think I probably need to watch everything again twice to be ready to ask questions, I think. On the other hand, I probably have like perhaps 20 different questions myself to ask you, but I think I'll just start with a quite objective clarification question, just to make sure that I got it right. Would it be fair to say that your main point here, well, there were many points, I guess, but would it be fair to say that you are actually arguing that the process of construction combination, of combining constructions, that's sometimes referred to as unification, mainly in more formal-oriented frameworks of construction grammar. Sometimes people simply say combination or integration without without giving further details of what they precisely mean by combination or integration. Just put things together. They have to be compatible. They must have compatible values or properties. Would it be fair to say that your main point here is that this process that people sometimes refer to as integration or unification is conceptual blending, conceptual integration, and that applies even for unremarkable cases, such as if I say, I don't know, blue cats, or even simple sentences. What we are doing all the time is we are blending, conceptual blending in Fauconnier and Turner sense. Is that what you are proposing?
Yes, you're absolutely right. And I mean, I'm not the first to say this. I mean, Mark Turner has been saying this for a long time, and Humpe and Schoenefeld have published a paper on this. But the reason why I'm sort of think the time is now good to talk about this is if you've got a computational model of construction grammar, it's brilliant. And the work that's been done in fluid construction grammar, in embodied construction grammar, in sign-based construction grammar, and earlier head-driven phrase structure grammar is exceptional, you know. But if we take, for example, sign-based construction grammar, which is a brilliant computational model of construction combination, again, you know, you could call it constraint satisfaction, and that's another metaphor really. But it's a way of arguing that there must be a process of combine in the grammar, okay? And if you do generative grammar, then merge, internal and external merge, that's a crucial sort of piece of the narrow faculty of language, at least last time I checked it was. But I would think that it's not just combination what humans do. You know, it's not just 1 + 1 is 2. Also, if you look at most closely at, well, head-driven phrase structure grammar started out with headed constraints, and in merge, there's always a headed construction. So alpha and beta, so either alpha or beta have to become the head. And that's not, I think, what's at the heart of language. If you combine linguistic constructions together with gestures in a specific instance, you do more than just putting them together. And it's not just that one is more important than the other. You've got communicative intent, you've got a pragmatic impulse while you do this. You take into account yourself as well as the addressee, and audience design if you want to take a social linguistic phenomenon that Ellen Bell has talked about a lot. These individual utterances that we don't produce in a vacuum. We've got a pragmatic intention, speech act theory. I mean, you could bring all of this into a specific situation, social linguistics, power hierarchies, and so on. Whenever we say something, we might use even a chunk like an apple a day keeps the doctor away. I would argue it's a construction. That's a saying. It's frozen. It's like a frozen pizza, right? A ready-made pizza. You just warm it up and you got it. You don't have to assemble the bits. But when you say it, you've got communicative intent. You blend into it the idea of who am I to tell you this, you know, the specific situation, that it's valuable advice and that the other person isn't offended by you just telling them to eat more fruit when they hate apples, that kind of thing. So I would argue that you can have a computational model, and for that, constraint satisfaction and unification are perfectly acceptable metaphors. But you got to remember, if you do usage-based construction grammar, then the main claim is that, well, symbolic thinking, the pairing of form and meaning, that seems to be something that is probably domain-specific in the sense it's a very human thing that seems to have evolved. But most other things, analogy, schematization, and classification, all of these building categories with prototypes are supposed to be domain general processes. So the strongest cognitive hypothesis that I can think of is to say that the combination of constructions of verbal information is also not a domain-specific pattern, but, and Mark Turner has shown this, unique conceptual blending for mathematical reasoning, for logical reasoning, and lots of other things. If it is a domain general process, the strongest usage-based claim would be that it's also at the heart of combination of constructions. Okay, this doesn't, notwithstanding the fact that, Gibbs Jr. has pointed out that, you know, for it to be falsifiable, it needs to evolve as a theory, and there's psycholinguistic studies on whether we can really explain it. But I think that human communication is not just 1 + 1. Two, if you have headedness, if alpha is 1 + 2 is 1 or 2. Sorry, I'm sort of rambling. But if you think back to the first tools that humans created, right? Think to the Stone Age and the first stone that was sort of used to carve something or to split something. And then you had a wooden handle at one point attached to it. So you had a bit of wood and you had a bit of stone. So you combined alpha and beta, stone and wood, but it was neither just a stick of wood nor just stone. It was a hammer. It was something that did something on top of what the two individual pieces could do. And for verbal information, I think that's also the case. We've got conventionalization, we've got strings which are bigger than single words, idioms and phrases and sayings and so on. But even when we are to those, you know, the ready-made pizza, that's just heated up in the working memory. There's other stuff that comes into it. And if we want to explain how fitting gestures, gesticulations, which people haven't stored and do for the first time, and how other people can interpret that, we need conceptual blending anyway, because no one would argue that it's the unification of a spontaneous gesture with a linguistic representation. So if you take multimodal communication seriously, I would think the strongest and, to my mind, most convincing claim would be that, yes, conceptual blending drives the combination of these multimodal constructs, but it also drives the combination of constructions.
Okay, thank you. All right, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so regarding this very point, I think now that my main doubt has been clarified, I think what strikes me as just two brief questions from myself, actually a comment and one question. What strikes me as perhaps surprising is that I could easily see how conceptual blending, conceptual integration relates to meaning, so the emergence of the meaning outputs, for that matter. But perhaps it's not as clear to me how you blend form, how exactly you blend form, meaning parents. And as far as I'm aware, I mean, I read Fauconnier and Turner work a long time ago. I'm not an expert, never been, but I was under the impression that they were talking about meaning, actually. So, and not structure, not syntax, not form. So I think what strikes me as surprising is how you blend or conceptually blend form together with meaning. And then my second question is, in terms of a research agenda, would that mean that you would expect people, linguists, to work out the details of conceptual blending of constructions in the paper, in the studies? So, for instance, okay, so there's this construction, this and this and this, so we put all these together, and exactly which aspects, properties come together and how their emerging form and meaning appear. So would you expect people to actually work out the details of conceptual blending to explain specific constructs in terms of a research agenda?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, the second part is going to be trickier than the first, I think, because if you think about an abstract construction, one that has slots in it, subject, verb, object, and oblique, so the resultative construction, then of course the idea is, you know, that you put a noun phrase like the firefighters into the subject slot, okay? But that is one metaphor. The metaphor is you've got a dent, okay? That's like an embodied metaphor, and you put something in there. That's the way we think. It's an embodied way of thinking. But in the same sense, on the formal level, you know, if you've got the firefighters, what they do, they're a package. They're not just form, they're not just meaning, but as a whole, you know, their form moves over to the form of the arguments of the agent slot, the subject slot, and of the agent slot on the meaning level. So in this sense, and that's also not an idea that just I came up with, but I know that Jacques Fillmore sometimes talked about constructions in this sense in an informal way, that, you know, things are like foils where you put them over each other. And as I said, Mark Turner in his recent publications has also pointed out that constructional combination could be seen as blending. So I would argue if we treat constructions as full meaning pairs, which we don't easily split up, then of course the mapping is not just one of combination of additive A plus B, but sometimes also overlap, and then you blend them. And of course there's going to be, and that brings us to the research agenda, there's going to be patterned aspects of what is brought to the equation. An argument structure construction gives you a who did what to whom perspective. And if you think about, he gave her the book, the transitive construction, the giving action, and the giving verb is the most frequent one in this construction. But if you then, and give, of course, as an agent, the recipient, call it that, roles, but we be actions that enter the, and there is some. So I hope my connection is okay, because he just said it's a bit shaky. So if you've got, he shrieked himself unconscious. Shriek normally only brings a single participant to this construct. The argument structure construction, however, does the who did what to whom. And it gives you slots also for the affected patient, as well as the state that they end up in. So of course you blend them partially, and shriek is still going to bring its event structure to the argument structure construction, as Bill Croft has pointed out. But the argument structure brings a force dynamic aspect to it that then allows you to add additional participants, which the verb in its most other uses in argument structure constructions doesn't have. So it's already necessary to say how the two can combine, and how the verbal action at the same time is also important for the interpretation and the fit to the argument structure construction. Because, and Bill Croft and Jovata and Hans Boas and many others have pointed out, it's not just the participants. So it doesn't mean, you know, of course, the correspondence principle, as Adele has pointed out, you know, that an obligatory participant role of a verb has to pop up into the argument role of the construction. There has to be a correspondence, but it's also the force dynamic nature of verbs which are important, whether they allow merging with a certain construction. So I think the example is paint. He sprayed paint on the wall, and he smeared paint on the wall. Coarse motion construction, someone does something and the paint ends up on a goal. Okay, so you can see how painting and smearing are both verbal actions that are compatible with that. But if you look at the intransitive uses, so paint sprayed on the wall, that's fine, but paint smeared on the wall doesn't work. Okay, and the reason it doesn't work is because of its verb semantics. So what the verb brings to it is a meaning that in spray, you've got someone who sprays, and then you've got the movement of the liquid through air as an independent process. That's at least the way that we as humans construe it. And then the paint ends on the wall. Okay, and because this spraying is construed as an independent event, you can blend the spray construction onto the intransitive paint sprayed on the wall construction, because you can focus on this process independently. But in smearing, you do this with a hand. The hand is always sort of attached to the paint, and without the hand, there's no smearing. So the verb is also important here. So it's a blending of both, and both sort of decide together whether a construct is then something that makes sense, to put it like that. So I would argue that, again, it's not just the combination where you say, well, it's a verb of paint covering of some sort, that spray and paint would obviously be in a similar frame, but it's also the specific verbal action that is calculated into this, whether you construe it into this argument structure construction. So it's not just that the argument construction construes everything, and you can put any type of verb into the argument structure construction, and it's always the argument structure construction that wins, right? Which would be similar to the idea of headedness, that you combine two things and it's one thing that wins. It's more complicated than that. It's both things come together, and they must blend together into something that makes sense in terms of the cognitive construal, our embodied experience, and lots of other things I didn't have the time to talk about.
Perfect, thank you. Thank you very much. We have some questions here from the audience. Okay, so Márcia Machado have a question from Márcia Machado, which is asking the following. Could you talk more about how you represent social network, social context, and discursive pragmatic context in terms of variables or constraints for systematic observation of communication? This is the first question.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question and a very important point. Alex Bergs and I have worked on football chants, and I'm going to tell you in a second why. Well, the first reason is I love football, but that was only part of it. When you look at football chants, then you've got like a very constrained setting. They are used in special situations, and you've got a fan community. So the speech community can clearly be identified. These are people, they're using indexical signs like scarves and shirts. They move in groups, they're in a fan block. And this particular group will also then have a number of chants that they can draw on. And not all of the chants are like an apple a day keeps the doctor away. Okay, there is, if you go to Liverpool, then the fans sing You'll Never Walk Alone. If you go to West Ham, they got a song called Bubbles, and that's performed in a certain kind of way. And you can also see that it's ritualistic in the kind of sense that people face the pitch. For Bubbles, for example, at West Ham, they've got the scarf in the air, or both hands in the air, open up. It's a communal singing event, and they all must share. How, like, creative, like chant is Rigoletto, like your car's too fast for you, because one footballer had an accident with he was fine, but he smashed his expensive sports car, and then the opponent fans knew about this, and they got a template to, well, one could say banter, or pragmatically to put down a single individual, and they used that, the tune, which always goes that number of syllables, to put down an individual. And if one speaker then says, your car's too fast for you, then the others can chime in, because they've got the same kind of background knowledge, and they can then reiterate this creative construct. And it's interesting, you know, because you really need to zoom in on a speech community in a sense like third wave social linguistics. You need to look at how individuals in a speech community construe that to really get to the heart of it. And I would argue that this is where social linguistics, with sort of modern approaches to it, has lots to offer to construction grammar, because you need to zoom in on these communities. A lot of the work in construction grammar is corpus-based, which is brilliant, but corpora are always collections of data over individuals. And Hans-Jörg Schmid recently had a brilliant book out where he again brings something to the forefront now. Oh, but you know, too often that if you look at a construction in a corpus, you get instances from individuals, but if it's a rare construction, you've got no way of knowing whether all speakers in the speech community have entrenched this. And sometimes we talk about entrenchment. I've done so very often when I talked about corpus results. And really you can, I mean, with sort of very general argument structure constructions, you've got good evidence that everyone will have heard them and will have used them. But there might be others like these football chants where it's clear that a lot of you might not know it, might not know them, and it's part of a community of practice. So if we want to establish what is creative for a specific situation, we need to know a lot about a community. For example, with the football chants, it could be that your car's too fast for you was new one day, and then another footballer did it like 4 weeks later, and the fans sang it again. But if you didn't know about the first instance, you would say, well, that's a very creative use, whereas it actually had already been established earlier. And as I said, I mean, I got a couple of papers out on the football chant constructions because I think it's brilliant in terms of how it brings together social linguistics to the forefront of construction grammar, and how it requires us to think about context and timing, because some songs like Are You Tottenham, Are You Tottenham, Are You Tottenham in Disguise, Are You Tottenham in Disguise, draw on a Welsh hymn called Bread of Heaven. It's repeated in certain situations when you are beating an opponent, and Arsenal fans will talk about Tottenham because that's their arch rival. So Arsenal might be playing Chelsea or West Ham or some other club, and then they might sing Are You Tottenham as a smear, sort of, when they're beating the other opponent. But it's important, there are contextual restrictions on this chant. Like, you've got to say good morning in the morning and good evening in the evening, right? Otherwise it's marked. And these constructions you've got to use in specific situations. And for example, if Arsenal was 2-1 up, and then the other team scored 2 goals, and now Arsenal is behind, then there's another chant that is based on the same hymn. You're not singing, you're not singing, you're not singing anymore, you're not singing anymore. So again, you can see the contextual interaction. And am I saying that's the only linguistics we should do? No. But I think communities of practice and adopting these social linguistic approaches, if we really want to see where do the creative constructs pop up for individuals, requires that kind of approach, that you look at smaller speech communities for a longer period of time. Of course, like with all data that we have, we can also look at corpus linguistics. For example, check out the COHA, Mark Davis corpus, Corpus of Historical American English, and track where a schematic construction was first used. One other thing I worked recently on is the verb the hell out of construction. He scared the hell out of me. He acted the shit out of this role. So you got a taboo word, that's part of it, and you've got out of, and it's a very creative pattern, right? But also kind of odd. And so you can look at a corpus and you can look at, okay, how does all of this pop up, and when was it used first? And of course, we can't go back in time, and that's something that, I mean, Martin Hilbert has pointed out. Diachronic construction grammar has to be very careful about assuming that they can pinpoint what happened in individual minds. We can't. There's no excavations and no way to trace back. But I see this as a huge painting. I see research, well, as a puzzle piece, actually, because I can't paint. I'm not the Bob Ross of linguistics. So let's just say we all contribute a puzzle piece, and there are, I think it's a huge frame, and there are lots of puzzles here. And formal construction grammarians bring something really important to the table. They've got all the formal models for bringing together constructions. I would use a different metaphor, but they've got this down to the perfect way of doing this computationally. And they test, obviously, their models where the two things can combine. I think cognitive linguists and conceptual blending brings a huge impulse for understanding all of these. Gesture studies, I mean, people have done so much about this, and I think it all comes together. And that's really what I think construction grammar is. It's an offer to think because of the domain generality, right? Because you do not believe in too many domain-specific ideas. You argue that how the mind works in language, got lots of conventionalized constructions, but how the mind works is pretty much the same. It's applicable and it ties into many other fields, and it's open to social linguistics. Will Hoffmann has done a lot on cognitive social linguistics. Bill Croft has focused on this. So I'm not prescribed from that. I'm not that type of person. I think we all had an important puzzle piece. But I think if we want to really get to the heart of linguistic creativity, then we need to talk to psychologists, social linguists, people who do gesture studies, listen to them and bring that together. Okay, I hope that sort of, at least to a certain degree, pointed out what you could do, that you could really zoom in into a social linguistic study, but at the same time that all other studies are still important to get to the full picture.
Thank you so much for a clear explanation. It really is fascinating. Okay, we have a number of comments here, such as very inspiring talk, what a privilege, etc. So everyone say thank you for being here. We have another question from Marcia Machado. She asks, considering constructs related to units of use, could micro-constructions / more substantive constructional patterns be related to working memory units? Could you talk about this association?
Yeah, that's a perfectly good question. And one of the problems is, of course, because we've got so many terms for things. But originally, when a microconstruction was used in historical linguistics, I think Elizabeth Traugott came up with a schema that you've got microconstruction. He gave her the book, which gave rise to mesoconstruction. Subject gave object to object, and then you have a macro construction, the most abstract level, subject, verb, object, object. And from a usage-based perspective, you would assume that it's bottom-up, how these more abstract constructions become schematized and stored, but the individual constructions would not be lost. And the term microconstruction is out there, and colloconstructional profile and verb-based constructions. Thomas Herbst and Bill Croft have used these terms. They're also important, sort of that it's not just, we don't generalize always to the highest level, and more specific item-based knowledge is important. Microconstructions are, of course, as the label says, constructions, so they're assumed to be stored in the long-term memory, but they are pretty close to the actual constructs, the utterance. So this is actually the case where small business is the backbone of our economy, is a construct that someone said, and maybe they created it online, blending constructions, then it's out there and a hearer can hear it and store it. And if they store this exemplar, like not schematic at all, but this specific string, and we've seen lots of politicians who've overused the construction almost, when they store it, it becomes a microconstruction. So the link between microconstruction and tokens of use is very close. And the only difference that I would sort of make, and it's not always very easy to say when was the construct first used, okay? Sometimes we're not able to answer this question, but there must have been a point when it was first used. That's sort of like a classical theological argument that regresses ad infinitum. There must have been a point when it got built first. So in this point, it's a construct. It's something that's created in the working memory. But of course, it doesn't stay in my mind. I say it, it becomes a token of performance. I hear it via my feedback loop, you hear it, and then it is stored. And if it gets, as a microconstruction, as we could call it, as a specific exemplar, as a fully substantive construction, there's lots of terms out there, but that's the meaning. Something that's created on the fly, if it's considered appropriate, it's a package that we keep, and then we store. If we keep it, that's the metaphor for long-term memory storage. So microconstructions are in the long-term memory, but they are, and the question is perfectly valid, they're closely linked to the constructs because these are the first traces of a construct being turned into a construction, stored for the first time in the long-term memory. Okay, I hope that answers the question. Okay, am I still online? Because I can't hear Diogo.
Hi, Thomas. I think that Diogo is having some internet issues. Just a second, please. Yeah, I think that he's coming back. Okay, just a second.
Okay, but I was loud and clear. It wasn't a problem at my end?
No. He went off and now he's back again. Thank you.
Okay, these are the joys of Zoom. We're all struggling with that. Hi, Diogo, welcome back.
Hello, thank you very much. So I'm guessing you have already answered, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm so sorry, I'm having an internet connection problems, as you can see. But I think we do not have further questions in the chat. We do have a comment by Mark Turner. I mentioned blended syntax or blending form earlier, and Mark Turner made the following comments: blended syntax, and then he mentions Fillmore and Atkins, and then gives a number of examples. Smear the wall with mud, but also risk your boat, shoot the waves, risk your money on a horse, risk your money in the stock market, exposed to, invest in. So this is the comment regarding blended syntax, blending form, not just me, if I got it correctly. And I don't think we don't have further questions, so I'd like to thank you again very, very much for this very inspiring talk. It's definitely challenging, as you said. I think you used the word complicated. Also fascinating. Definitely, the more complicated it gets, the more fascinating it gets as well. Like this, maybe. I think that would be my own personal gesture. So thank you very much. I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank the audience again for being here, for the questions, and also Abraham for, again, once more, for this initiative that brings us together in a way during the pandemics. I think that's it, right? Thank you very much, everyone. Don't really know what I should say now, but thank you again. Bye-bye. See you soon. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy. Hope to catch up with you all soon in person. Bye.
Bye-bye.